Hey, this guy I'm about to introduce is a real phenomenon in the broadcasting industry. He holds the all-time record for network hours of television.
Really?
And that's what I say right there. And his show is the most copied format ever devised for TV. Let's welcome the star of American Bandstand, my good friend, Mr. Dick Clark.
I brought you a new card in case you ran out of material. What kind of a line is that? I ran out of all the questions.
I asked him all the questions I had, and that was my one big fear before I came on to do this. This is my first time to host a show.
I was just saying to somebody when we were talking backstage, you said I ought to be nervous, and you said you weren't. You're not nervous.
No.
You're just sitting here. What bothers me is as a city boy to come out with two guys who are drawling and a picking and a singing and talking about it's 2 miles past the speed limit and all. How do you beat that kind of thing?
Oh, boy.
I think I'll just lie back here and enjoy a while.
Don't kick my water over. Your show was, That is a popular soft drink and nothing more. But the choreography for our show is by Jack Daniels.
I'll give it a 35. I like the beats.
How am I going to get into this first question? What time is it? That's
These are the toughies.
Your show was living. Your show was live for a long It was live for a long time, wasn't it? Yeah.
No, we used to do that show, Roger, for 3 hours and 15 minutes a day. 5 days a week. And then we did a Saturday show and a Sunday show. And it was
videotape came
I have the tape at home of when I did the show in 1962. The winter of 1962.
You're kidding.
With, when I remember, you don't remember, but I had a watch band on. I had Turn Around, Look at Me on at the time.
Yeah.
And I had a watch band on with turquoise in it, Indian watch band. And he said, that's unusual. And I noticed, I said, yeah, it's a good band. That was my first network television show.
Were you a beach boy ever?
Yeah.
Didn't you sit in
6
for
months.
Brian Wilson?
Yeah, for 6 months.
You know, the strange thing about that show, Roger, I sat here one night with Merv, and he said he did it, and I didn't realize it. We've done...
Merv did your show?
Merv did the show. It was some godforsaken song. He hadn't forgotten it. I mean, we made jokes about it. It just was another era.
It was when he had Freddie Martin with him.
No, it was right after. But there have been over 6,000 people appear on that thing, and an awful lot of people made their first appearance. I could tell you a story about live television now. 100,000 years ago, as a matter of fact, Merv Griffin did a show in the little theater in New York City. That it was a little vest pocket theater, seats about 300 people. And in those days, we did everything, quote, live, but everybody did lip sync. He sang to the record. Yeah. But most of the guys that had hit records were scared to death. They had never appeared in front of anybody ever before, and they might have sold maybe 2-3 million records. And very frequently, you'd have to introduce somebody, give them a great big build-up. And this chap will remain nameless because it's just as well when you hear the end of the story. But I did this thing, and I was kind of like building him up and saying, here he is, the greatest thing since sliced cheese. And I'm saying he's handsome, and he's got great talent and so forth. He stepped to the front of the footlights, and he threw up on the first 3 rows. The record came on, he went, live!
And it was Red Skull.
In those days, it was glorious black and white, thank goodness. When we did the bandstand, it's late night now. I can tell stories like this because they're not all that bad off. But we've had girls, when they're doing those crazy dances, lose intimate pieces of apparel in the middle of the floor. And the cameraman's dolling in on the shoes, and there's a set of undies.
You've probably discovered some of the music business recording greats.
Funny you should ask.
Yeah.
No.
Just happen to have a little...
You want to reminisce a little bit?
I'd love to.
Let me just see what...
I was at your house one night. You were showing some of the films. You have films of all those old shows.
I'm going to tell you, if we have time, about a project As a matter of fact, 20 minutes before we went on this show, I was in the dressing room talking about a guy about using some film on him. We're doing what we call the definitive history of rock and roll, a 20-year history.
Oh.
And maybe you guys, if you're nice enough, will let me use a little piece of it. But there'll be over 200 artists in this thing. And you try to get permission from 200 people and pay them 23 cents to do it.
You can turn around and look at me if you like.
I was never on your show. I was in the country music end.
Can I tell a story about you when we did the rock and roll tours?
Yeah.
We used to send out shows for 30, 60, 90 days in a row in a bus, and we'd sleep every other night in a hotel. And the top pay in those days was, $1,000 a week. Tickets were $1.50. We'd have 17 acts. And this was a little later on, into the 60s and so forth, and I called a man named X Cosset down in, Nashville?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, X, you're sending out a tour. And he says, we got this young boy, Roger Miller. And I said, oh, yeah, they got a thing called Dang Me done. Yes, wonderful. And we did the whole thing. And I said, well, what are you asking for him? And he said, want $1,200 a week. And I said, you're out of your mind. It'll be a long, cold day before that hillbilly's worth $1,200 a week. Whatever happened to you, Roger?
I don't know. It's a cold day outside, though.
He was staying all night with me out here when Dang Me come out.
Yeah.
He was running. He was nervous, like, boy, I got a record, and I don't know what it's going to do. And the next 2 weeks later, it's number one.
Yeah, I was
Just
living.
unreal.
I was living part-time in Lee Hazelwood's guest house.
Right.
He had a little shack out behind his house, and I'd go over and stay at your house. Oh.
That's reminiscent.
All right, I'll quick leaf through some of the people. Now, mind you, I take absolutely zero credit for any of this. I had a vehicle that played records and music, and it was the only one of its kind, so he got no other store in town. I had nothing personally to do with any of these people other than the fact that here's the joint, come on in and use it. First television appearance, Dick, we're going to use this one over here, was the fellow who was probably, maybe, along with Elvis, the king of rock and roll. Bill Haley and the Comets made their appearance in the bandstand in 1954 or 5. The show went on in 1952. This man was one of the first black artists that was accepted by white people everywhere. Mr. Fats Domino had 37 hits, sold over 40 million records the world over.
Hey, Dick.
Yeah.
Before you go any further, I was at the airport in El Paso last week. I was down there deer hunting.
Huh?
And guess who came up at the airport? So,
Antoine.
No, Bill Haley.
Oh, you're kidding.
He lives in Juarez, Mexico.
Sure.
Tours.
We talked just the other day about a thing called Rock Around the Clock, which is a little chunk of the film we want to make.
Yeah, well, go ahead. I was
Now,
weird.
about a week ago, according to, if this tape schedule works out, this man came and redid a show on the 50s right here in Hollywood. This fellow's name is Little Richard. And when older people first saw him, they had a conniption fit because they couldn't believe what this man did to people. Now, he was wild for his day, but you want to see the biggies that made their first appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Real biggies.
Oh, yeah.
Now, look at this ad. We introduced these men in November of 1957.
Tom and Jerry.
Now, creep in and look at those two fellas. Do they look at all familiar? That's Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel.
Yeah.
Hey,
Tom and Jerry.
they look different now.
I've offered to sell them this picture. And then there's, you guys dig country music. He's one of the giants of all time.
Yeah, he hasn't changed much.
Mr. Jerry Lee Lewis.
He's still kicking the piano.
Got to tell you a story about the next fella. He came to me with a song that he'd written with a disc jockey in New York, and he dragged around. He was an arrogant son of a gun in those days, and then when he got really popular, he was still a mean
Real
son of a
arrogant,
gun.
yeah.
And everybody said, whatever happened to him? And I said, well, he's always been the same way, and he's one of my closest, dearest friends. And after he did things like, well, I'm getting ahead of the story. I can't use the punchline. Splish Splash and
Right.
Queen of the Hop.
Yeah.
He wanted to do a song, and I said, it's never going to make it. It became the biggest song in 1959, Mac the Knife. That's what Bobby Darin was like in the late 50s. And then there were very few gals in those days. Miss Connie Francis is probably the queen of all the singers. And a lady named Helen Noga called me once. In those days, you didn't call colored people colored or black. You just called them Negroes. And they said, we have this young colored singer we'd like you to have you use if you could possibly squeeze him in. And that was Johnny Mathis. And my friends, you go to the Philadelphia era, there was Frankie Avalon, Fabian, Bobby Rydell. You could freeze a comb in that hairdo. And the ever-popular Danny and the Juniors.
Yes, sir.
Now, one last story, and this is, who did you find and who didn't you find? I was in the music business, and they made me get out of it. And they had the feeling that I was trying to put a hang-hold on the whole thing. Two friends of mine that took over a record company fell on bad times, and they went to England. And they found a group, and they brought it back, and the guy said to me, "Gee, the biggest thing you've ever seen." And he said, "I appreciate it if you put it in that portion where the kids say, I'll give it an 85, it's hard to dance to, but I like the beat," or whatever. And we put it in there, and they panned the daylights out of this record. They hated it. And I looked at the picture of the group, and I said, "You got to be kidding. They're going to be laughed off the stage." And this is what they looked like in the early 60s.
Do you remember what did they call them, the mop heads? Was that it?
Yeah.
And that was long hair.
That was
then.
long hair then. Can you believe that?
And in just 7 years, that looks almost like a crew cutter, almost like a regular haircut.
What was the guy asked Ringo, said, "What do you call your hairdo?" And he said, "I call it Henry."
So much for the past.
You keep a card file on the performers that have been on your show?
Yeah, and I'll tell you about it right after this word.
We got...